I've watched you for months. The whisper was barely a breath against her skin before the world dissolved. The lights didn't just fade, they were extinguished, plunging the gallery into a thick, absolute blackness. In that sudden void, my eyes were useless, forcing my other senses into overdrive. I could hear the sharp intake of her breath, smell the complex, woodsy notes of her perfume, and feel the heat radiating from her suit jacket. I was trapped in the dark with the woman I had admired from the shadows, and the comfortable safety of distance had just evaporated. For 6 months, my Tuesday afternoons belonged to the Metropolitan Gallery. Ostensibly, I was there for the modernist rotation or the new acquisition of 19th century silver. But we both know why I really came back, week after week. The gallery itself was a masterpiece of atmosphere. The echoing click of heels on marble, the specific, dusty warmth of floor wax and old canvas, the way the light filtered through the high skylights, catching dust motes in suspension. It was a place of quiet reverence, a sanctuary where you were supposed to look, but never touch. But the most captivating exhibit wasn't behind velvet ropes or under shatterproof glass. It was Alara. She moved through the halls with a terrifying kind of grace, the kind that made you hold your breath just to see where she would land. She was the head curator, a fact I learned not by asking, but by observing the way the security guards straightened their posture when she passed, the way the junior staff scrambled to open doors for her. She wore sharp, tailored suits that seemed cut from the same midnight fabric as the sky outside. Navy, charcoal, deep black. Clean lines that emphasized a posture of absolute command. I became a student of her movements. I studied how she would pause before a painting, tilting her head just slightly to the left, her eyes narrowing as if she were dissecting the artist's intent with a scalpel. I tracked her hands, strong and capable, gesturing to a team of installers, directing the placement of a sculpture with the precision of a conductor. There was a rhythm to her, a cadence that I found myself memorizing. I convinced myself, in the beginning, that this was just another form of aesthetic appreciation. I told myself that admiring the curve of her jawline or the way her hair fell across her forehead was no different than admiring the brushwork on a Renoir. I positioned myself as the detached observer, the silent witness. I would stand near the Greco-Roman busts, pretending to study the marble, while my reflection in the display case traced the lines of her reflection across the room. But you can only lie to yourself for so long before the truth starts to ache in your chest. It wasn't aesthetic. It was visceral. It was a magnetic pull that tugged at my center every time she walked into a room. I found myself timing my visits to coincide with her floor rounds, learning her schedule better than I knew my own work calendar. I knew she took her coffee black in the museum cafe at 3:15. I knew she checked the locks on the East Wing personally every Tuesday evening before closing. The glass cases and the velvet ropes became my safety barriers. They weren't there to protect the art from me. They were there to protect me from the overwhelming urge to cross the room. They offered a safe distance, a buffer zone where I could exist in her orbit without burning up in the atmosphere. But safety has a way of becoming suffocating. The silence of the museum, once peaceful, began to feel heavy with things unsaid. The polite fiction of being just another patron fascinated by the Impressionists was wearing thin. I realized that the safety of distance had become a cage, and I was rattling the bars. If the glass cases were the physical barriers, our eyes became the breach. It started subtly, the way these things always do, a coincidence that happens one too many times to be accidental. I would look up from a placard describing a modernist sculpture, and there she would be, standing at the far end of the gallery, her clipboard lowered, watching me. At first, I assumed she was monitoring a potential security risk, I was, after all, the woman who lingered too long in the shadows of the East Wing. But security guards watch your hands. They watch your bag. Alara watched my face. There is a specific language to eye contact in a public space. Usually, it's a quick, apologetic thing. Eyes meet, panic sets in, and both parties look away, pretending to be fascinated by the floor tiles. But Alara didn't follow those rules. When our eyes met across the expanse of the Great Hall, she didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She held the gaze, unflinching and deliberate, letting the silence between us stretch into something tangible. It was a challenge, a silent acknowledgement that she knew I was looking, and she was giving me permission to continue. That look was heavier than any physical touch could have been. It pinned me to the spot, making the air in the gallery feel suddenly thin and electrified. Yet, the doubt was a constant, nagging companion. The human brain is excellent at protecting itself, at rationalizing away desire to avoid the sting of rejection. I told myself that she was a curator, and her job was engagement. Maybe this intense focus was just professional courtesy dialed up to 11. Maybe she was just wondering why the same woman in the same leather jacket showed up every Tuesday to stare at the same 3 paintings. I oscillated wildly between the intoxicating certainty that the attraction was mutual and the crushing fear that I was projecting a romance onto a woman who was simply doing her job. But then came the memory that shattered my professional courtesy theory completely. It was 2 weeks ago, in the smaller, more intimate gallery dedicated to ancient jewelry. I was leaning over a case, studying a gold torque, when I felt a presence at my shoulder. I didn't need to turn around to know it was her. The scent of her, something sharp like cedar and warm like amber, arrived a split second before she did. She stood next to me, not facing me, but facing the glass, our reflections side by side. "It was worn by a queen," she had said, her voice low, vibrating in the small space between us. She refused to take it off, even when the city fell. She wasn't looking at the gold. In the reflection of the glass, she was looking at me. We were close enough that if I had shifted my weight just an inch to the right, our arms would have brushed. The proximity was dizzying. I could see the fine grain of the fabric of her blazer, the way her breath fogged the glass slightly. She stayed there for a beat longer than necessary, the silence thick with the things we weren't saying, before she nodded once and walked away. That moment changed everything. It was the catalyst that turned my passive observation into an active need. I realized I couldn't survive on scraps of eye contact and accidental proximity anymore. The looking phase had to end because the pressure of the unspoken was becoming dangerous. I was done being the silent admirer. I was done with the safety of the velvet ropes. I needed to know if the heat I felt radiating off her was real, or if I was just burning alone. The next Tuesday, I told myself, I wouldn't just watch. I would speak. The Tuesday that shattered the stalemate arrived wrapped in a shroud of violent, unrelenting gray. It wasn't just a rainstorm. It was a deluge, an atmospheric temper tantrum that had battered the city since dawn. By late afternoon, the streets were running like rivers, and the usual flow of tourists and art students had dried up completely. The storm had scrubbed the city clean of casual visitors, leaving the museum hollowed out, a vast, echoing cavern of stone and silence. It felt less like a public institution and more like a private fortress, isolated from the rest of the world by a curtain of falling water. Inside the East Wing, the atmosphere had shifted into something moody and surreal. The massive skylights, usually portals for soft, diffuse sunshine, were now dark, drumming with the relentless rhythm of the rain. The natural light had failed hours ago, dying out into a bruised purple gloom, which meant the artificial gallery lights were working overtime. The halogen spots cut through the dimness with surgical precision, carving the sculptures out of the shadows and making the oil paintings gleam with an almost supernatural vibrancy. The contrast was stark. Deep, pooling shadows in the corners and blindingly bright focal points in the center. It felt theatrical, staged, as if the lighting director had set the scene for a climax. I was standing near the entrance to the wing, pretending to read a wall text about Byzantine iconography for the 5th time, but the words were swimming before my eyes. My internal state was a mirror image of the storm outside, chaotic, pressurized, and waiting to break. The coiled feeling in my chest had tightened until it was painful, a physical ache of anticipation that made my hands tremble. I had spent the last hour pacing, fighting the urge to flee, fighting the urge to stay, caught in a paralysis of nerves. The air in the gallery felt thick, heavy with humidity and the static charge of the storm. Or maybe that was just the electricity coming off my own skin. Then, I heard the sound that cut through the noise of the rain. The distinct, rhythmic click of heels on the hardwood. Alara appeared at the far end of the corridor. She was beginning her closing protocols, a ritual I had watched from a distance a dozen times before, but never with this much adrenaline in my veins. She moved with a systematic efficiency, a clipboard tucked against her hip, a ring of keys jingling softly in her hand. She was the warden of this beauty, the final authority on what was locked away and what was left exposed. She moved from case to case, checking the locks, verifying the humidity sensors, her movements fluid and practiced. She was entirely focused, her profile sharp against the dark walls, unaware, or appearing to be unaware, that she wasn't alone. I watched her check the handle of the emergency exit, her back to me, the line of her suit jacket stretching as she reached up. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. We were alone. The security guard who usually patrolled this sector had likely retreated to the main rotunda to watch the storm. There were no wandering tourists, no school groups, no witnesses. The emptiness of the room was absolute. My hesitation suddenly felt cowardly. If I walked out into the rain now, without speaking, I knew I would never come back. The regret would be a ghost, haunting me every Tuesday for the rest of my life. I pushed off the wall. The movement felt seismic, loud in the quiet space, though my boots made no sound on the runner. I abandoned the pretense of the art. I abandoned the safety of the perimeter. I walked down the center of the aisle, closing the distance between the observer and the subject, moving steadily toward the woman who held the keys to the room, and, terrifyingly, the keys to my composure. The invisible barrier dissolved with every step. I was walking into the storm. Alara was standing before a tall, narrow display case housing a collection of Etruscan gold, her posture deceptively relaxed. The jewelry inside was thousands of years old, intricate webs of gold filigree that shimmered under the halogen spots. But she wasn't studying the craftsmanship. I could see her eyes in the reflection of the glass. She was looking past the gold, past the velvet backing, and staring directly at the ghost of my figure, approaching from the dark corridor behind her. The reflection was our meeting ground, a two-dimensional space where we could touch without touching, where the rules of physical contact hadn't yet been broken. I stopped 10 feet away, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, loud enough that I feared it would echo in the silent gallery. The storm outside battered the roof, a dull, distant roar that only emphasized the stillness inside. This was the edge of the cliff. I could turn back now, walk out into the rain, and preserve the safe, sterile mystery of our Tuesday ritual. I could go home and dream about her, safe in the knowledge that I had never risked rejection. But the pull was too strong. The gravity of her presence was dragging me in, dismantling my defenses one by one. I took another step, then another. The sound of my boots on the floor was swallowed by the vastness of the room. I moved into her personal space, crossing the invisible boundary that separates strangers from intimates. I was close enough now to catch the scent of her properly for the first time, no longer a faint trace left in her wake, but a tangible presence. It was sharper up close, a complex mix of cedar, old paper, and something distinctly electric, like the air before a lightning strike. It was a smell that bypassed my logic and went straight to the primitive part of my brain that deals in want and warning. She didn't turn around. She didn't stiffen or pull away. She remained perfectly still, watching my reflection grow larger in the glass, her expression unreadable, but intensely focused. It was an invitation, silent and terrifying. She was letting me come to her. "It's beautiful," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, rougher, lower, stripped of the polite cadence I used for the rest of the world. I wasn't talking about the gold. Ilar's eyes in the reflection shifted, locking onto mine. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her mouth. "It's trapped," she replied, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made the air between us feel heavy. "Beautiful things usually are. We put them behind glass to keep them safe, but we also keep them from being touched. It's a cruel kind of preservation." The subtext was a live wire between us. She wasn't talking about the gold, either. I took the final step, closing the remaining gap until I was standing directly behind her, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her body. The air conditioner hummed, cool and sterile, but the space between us was scorching. I could see the fine hairs on the back of her neck, the precise cut of her dark blazer, the way her breathing had shifted, shallow, controlled, waiting. The glass case in front of us was no longer a barrier. It was a mirror, witnessing a collision. I leaned in. The movement felt reckless, a surrender to an impulse I had been fighting for half a year. I brought my face close to the side of her head, invading the sanctuary of her personal space. My breath ghosted against the sensitive skin below her ear, and I saw her eyes in the reflection widen slightly, the pupils dilating, swallowing the iris. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned back, just a fraction of an inch, closing the circuit. The words had been building in my throat for months. A confession that felt more like an accusation. I needed her to know. I needed to shatter the plausible deniability once and for all. "I've watched you for months," I whispered, the words catching in the sudden dryness of my throat, delivered directly against the shell of her ear. Ilara froze. It wasn't the freeze of fear. It was the suspension of a predator who has just heard the snap of a twig. The tension in her shoulders didn't look like defense. It looked like anticipation. The gallery held its breath. The storm outside seemed to pause. For a singular, suspended second, the world narrowed down to the heat of her skin and the echo of my confession hanging in the air. Then, the universe answered. There was a sharp, mechanical clunk from somewhere deep in the building's infrastructure, followed instantly by the death of the halogen lights. The world didn't just fade, it vanished. The darkness was absolute, sudden, and total. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't simply the lights turning off. It was as if reality itself had been deleted, leaving us suspended in a void so profound, it felt physical. One moment, I was standing in a gallery of illuminated gold and polished wood. The next, I was drowning in ink. The suddenness of it was disorienting, a jarring sensory amputation that left my brain scrambling for input. My eyes, useless now, strained against the blackness, searching for a silhouette, a reflection, a glint of metal, anything to anchor me in space. But there was nothing. The visual world had been extinguished, and with it, the familiar geometry of the room. The walls, the ceiling, the exit signs, they were all gone, swallowed by a heavy, suffocating velvet. Then came the silence. The mechanical hum of the climate control system, a white noise I hadn't even consciously registered until it was gone, died with a sputtering sigh. The sudden quiet was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. The only sound remaining was the distant, muffled drumming of the rain on the roof, a rhythmic reminder of the storm that had isolated us. But inside the gallery, the silence was intimate and immediate. It amplified the smallest sounds, turning the rustle of fabric into a roar and the shift of weight on a heel into a seismic event. The acoustics of the room seemed to shrink, collapsing from the vast, echoing hall down to the 3 feet of space between us. My hand instinctively shot out, seeking a landmark, something solid to prove the world still existed. My palm connected with the cool, smooth surface of the display case. The glass was shocking against my skin, a stark, unyielding coldness that grounded me. I curled my fingers against it, using the tactile sensation to map my position. I was still here. The gold was still behind the glass, and, most importantly, Alara was still in front of me. She hadn't moved. In the panic of the blackout, the instinct to flee or to gasp or to stumble away would have been natural, but she had remained rooted to the spot. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her presence with a clarity that was almost overwhelming. Without the distraction of sight, my other senses sharpened to a razor's edge. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a tangible wave of warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold glass under my hand. It was a biological signal, a beacon in the dark that told me exactly where she was standing. She was inches away, close enough that if I leaned forward, the darkness would bridge the gap between us. Then I heard it, the sound of her breathing. It was close, terrifyingly close, right at the level of my chin. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic breathing of the composed curator I had watched for months. It was slightly faster, a jagged, shallow rhythm that betrayed the effect of my whisper. I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that my confession was still hanging in the air between us, unacknowledged but undeniably heard. The darkness had stripped away the social armor we both wore. There were no sharp suits to hide behind, no professional expressions to maintain, no guarded glances to interpret. There was just the sound of air moving in and out of her lungs and the scent of cedar and amber blooming in the stillness. The fear of the dark wrestled with a thrill so potent it made my knees weak. This was the terrifying intimacy of the confessional. The darkness acted as a shield, removing the risk of judgment that comes with eye contact. I didn't have to see her reaction to know I had affected her. I could hear it in the hitch of her breath. I didn't have to worry about looking foolish. I was invisible. The social anxiety that usually governed my interactions with her evaporated, leaving only a raw, electric connection. The adrenaline spiked in my blood, not from the power outage, but from the realization that I was trapped in the dark with the object of my obsession, and she wasn't pulling away. The seconds stretched out, elongated by the sensory deprivation. I stood there, one hand on the cold glass, the other hanging by my side, waiting. The air felt charged, thick with the static of the storm and the unspoken tension. I could feel the ghost of my own whisper still echoing in my ears. "I've watched you for months," and the weight of her silence pressing back against me. It wasn't a rejection. It was a pause, a hesitation, a decision being made in the dark. I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of my own exhale would shatter the fragile equilibrium we had found in the void. And then, cutting through the darkness like a knife, her voice arrived. "You think you were subtle?" Her voice cut through the obsidian dark, not from where I expected it, but closer, lower, stripped of the polished professional veneer she wore like armor during the daylight hours. It wasn't the voice of the head curator addressing a donor. It was the voice of a woman speaking into the void, knowing exactly who was listening. The question hung there, rhetorical and teasing, vibrating in the small pocket of air between us. I opened my mouth to defend my stealth, to claim that my months of observation had been discreet. But the darkness seemed to swallow my ability to lie. Before I could formulate a response, she spoke again, the sound moving slightly to my left. "I didn't just know you were watching," she confessed, the words slow and deliberate. "I counted on it. Every Tuesday at 3 p.m., I felt the weight of your gaze the moment you walked through those double doors. You thought you were hidden in the shadow of the Greco-Roman busts? You thought the reflection in the display cases only worked one way?" A soft, breathy laugh escaped her, a sound so intimate it felt like a physical caress. "I wasn't checking the locks for the museum's security, darling. I was performing. I was making sure the lighting hit my profile just right, because I knew you were the only one in the room actually looking." The revelation hit me harder than the blackout. The power dynamic I had constructed in my head, me as the active observer, her as the passive subject, shattered instantly. I hadn't been the hunter. I had been the audience. She hadn't been oblivious. She had been curating the experience, managing my attention just as carefully as she managed the gallery's collection. The realization made my knees weak, a sudden vertigo that had nothing to do with the lack of light. Then, I felt a touch. It started as a ghost of a sensation, the faintest brush of fabric against the bare skin of my forearm. I flinched, a purely instinctual reaction to the sudden breach of my physical boundaries in the pitch black. But I didn't pull away. Emboldened by my lack of retreat, her hand solidified its presence. Her fingers, cool and confident, landed on my arm with the precision of someone who didn't need eyes to navigate. It was a shocking, grounding weight in the sensory vacuum. She didn't grab me. She traced me. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, sliding down the length of my forearm, her nails dragging lightly against my skin, sending shivers racing up my shoulder to the base of my neck. It was a mapping expedition. She was learning the topography of the woman she had only ever seen from 20 feet away. The darkness, which had felt like a cage moments ago, suddenly felt like a cocoon, wrapping us in a private world where only this tactile connection existed. Her hand reached my wrist and stopped. She circled it with her fingers, her thumb pressing gently but firmly against the inside of my wrist, directly over my pulse point. "Fast," she whispered, her voice right at my ear again, though I hadn't heard her move closer. "Your heart is hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. Are you afraid?" "No," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a rasp. "Good," she murmured, "because fear is boring. Anticipation is useful." She held my wrist, anchoring me in the dark. I realized then that she wasn't just holding my arm. She was holding my composure hostage. She could feel the biological truth of my reaction, the thudding rhythm of my blood that betrayed every ounce of desire I had tried to keep hidden behind glass cases and velvet ropes. I was completely exposed, stripped of my visual cues and my safe distance, while she remained an enigma in the dark, a voice and a touch that controlled the entire room. "I've wanted to do this for months," she admitted, her thumb stroking the frantic pulse at my wrist, a soothing, maddening rhythm. "I've wanted to cross the room and see if you were as terrified of this tension as I was. But I'm the curator. I can't touch the exhibits. I had to wait for the exhibit to come to me." The metaphor hung between us, heavy and charged. I wasn't just a visitor anymore. I was hers to examine. The darkness had given her permission to drop the professional facade, And what lay beneath was something far more commanding, far more dangerous, and infinitely more compelling. She shifted her weight, and her knee brushed against my thigh, a fleeting, accidental contact that felt like a lightning strike. "So," she said, her voice dropping another octave, turning the single syllable into a challenge. "You've been watching, you've been waiting, and now the lights are out, and I have you exactly where I want you. Tell me, was it worth the wait?" "More than worth it," I breathed, the truth slipping out before I could polish it into something clever. Ilara didn't reply with words. She replied with gravity. She took the final half step that obliterated the concept of personal space entirely. In the pitch black, the loss of sight made the sudden encroachment of her body feel seismic. I felt the warmth of her traverse the inch of air between us, a radiant heat that seemed to press against the front of my clothes like a physical weight. Instinctively, I shuffled backward, seeking retreat, but my shoulder blades met the unforgiving, cool surface of the display case. I was trapped, pinned between the ancient cold gold behind the glass and the very modern, burning reality of the curator in front of me. She knew it too. I heard the fabric of her suit jacket whisper as she raised her arm, and then her hand planted against the glass right beside my head. She wasn't touching me, not with that hand, but the cage was complete. She had effectively boxed me in, creating a private, pressurized atmosphere where the only air available to breathe was the air she had just exhaled. "You're trembling," she noted softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a data point. She was cataloging my reactions, adding them to her collection. "I'm not," I lied, though my voice lacked any real conviction. "You are," she countered, her voice dropping lower, vibrating through the darkness to settle somewhere deep in my chest. "And you should be. We're breaking every rule in the building." She leaned in closer. I couldn't see her, but my skin mapped her approach with terrifying accuracy. I felt the ghost of her blazer brush against my waist, a friction that sent a shockwave through my nervous system. The darkness, which had felt vast and empty moments ago, now felt incredibly heavy, thick with a tension that was almost suffocating. This was the forbidden proximity I had fantasized about from the safety of the velvet ropes, but the reality was far more volatile. It wasn't soft or romantic. It was sharp, dangerous, and intoxicating. "I didn't want to follow the rules," I whispered into the void between us. "I was tired of the glass." "I know," Ilara murmured. Her face was so close now that I could feel the rhythm of her breath against my cheek, warm and scented with that maddening mix of cedar and rain. "Why do you think I stood there? Why do you think I let you walk up behind me? I wanted to see if you were brave enough to break the glass." Her hand, the one that had been holding my wrist, slid slowly up my arm, her fingers tracing the line of my bicep, the curve of my shoulder, before coming to rest at the base of my throat. Her thumb pressed gently against the pulse point there, which was hammering a frantic, traitorous rhythm. She held me there, not with force, but with the sheer weight of her intent. "You think you were subtle?" she asked again, echoing her earlier question. But this time, the tone was different. It wasn't mocking. It was hungry. "I didn't want to be," I confessed. "Not anymore." "Good," she said, "because subtlety is useless in the dark." She shifted, her body aligning with mine in the blindness. Her thigh brushed against mine, a solid, grounding contact that made my knees buckle slightly. I pressed harder against the display case, the cool glass biting into my back, grounding me as the sensation of her proximity threatened to unmoor me completely. We were standing on the precipice of something irreversible. The air between our faces was charged, electric, humming with the static of a storm that had nothing to do with the rain outside. I tilted my chin up, guided by the heat of her, finding the space where her face hovered just inches from mine. I could feel the warmth of her lips, the slight hitch in her breath that matched my own. It was the sensory detail of the almost, that agonizing, exquisite fraction of a second before contact, stretched out into an eternity. We didn't kiss. We existed in the space right before the kiss, the space where the potential energy is highest. It was an exercise in restraint, a test of wills. Neither of us moved to close that final millimeter. We just stood there in the crushing dark, breathing each other's air, letting the tension coil tighter and tighter until it felt like the gallery itself was going to snap. It was more intimate than any touch could have been, this shared, silent agreement to stand on the edge and look down. "Alara," I whispered, her name feeling like a prayer or a plea. "I'm here," she answered, her lips brushing against the corner of my mouth as she spoke, a phantom kiss that promised everything and gave nothing. "I'm right here." And then the world exploded. The explosion wasn't sound, it was light. The halogens slammed back into existence with a violence that felt physical, a blinding, white-hot assault that seared through my retinas. The pitch-black intimacy we had inhabited for the last 10 minutes was instantaneously incinerated, replaced by the clinical, unforgiving glare of the gallery spots. It was like being ripped from a warm, deep ocean and thrown onto a concrete floor at noon. I gasped, throwing a hand up to shield my eyes, the sudden brightness sending a sharp spike of pain through my head. But even through the squinting and the spots dancing in my vision, the first thing I looked for, the only thing I looked for, was her. Alara hadn't moved. The darkness had hidden the physical reality of our closeness, but the light exposed it with brutal clarity. She was inches from me, so close that the lapels of her blazer were nearly brushing the front of my jacket. The visual confirmation of what I had only felt in the dark was staggering. I saw the flush rising on her neck, a jagged map of color against her pale skin that betrayed the composure she was fighting to reclaim. I saw the rise and fall of her chest, still matching that slightly accelerated rhythm I had heard in the silence. But it was her eyes that held me. They were wide, the pupils blown so large they had swallowed the iris, black pools of adrenaline and desire that hadn't yet constricted against the light. For a heartbeat, she looked unguarded. She looked like someone who had just been caught in the middle of a heist, breathless and exhilarated. Crucially, she didn't step back. That was the moment that sealed it. The lights were on. The emergency was over. The social contract of the museum, the one that said curators and visitors stayed on opposite sides of the glass, was technically back in effect. Instinct should have repelled us apart. We should have jumped back, smoothing our clothes, putting polite distance between us before anyone could witness the impropriety of our proximity. But we didn't. We stood our ground, trapped in the amber of the moment, refusing to surrender the space we had claimed in the dark. I lowered my hand from my eyes, blinking rapidly, and looked at her. Really looked at her. Not as the distant figure of authority, and not as the disembodied voice in the dark, but as the woman standing right in front of me. I saw the fine lines of tension around her mouth, the way her hands were unclenched at her sides, resisting the urge to reach out again. The silence between us now wasn't the empty silence of the blackout. It was a loud, screaming thing. It was a silent conversation that happened in the span of 3 seconds. "We can't pretend this didn't happen." Her gaze bored into mine, unflinching even under the harsh lights. It was a confirmation. She wasn't going to gaslight me. She wasn't going to laugh it off as a moment of panic-induced madness. She was standing in the wreckage of our professional distance and refusing to rebuild the wall. Then reality intruded. From the far end of the corridor, heavy footsteps echoed. Not the rhythmic click of Alara's heels, but the dull, purposeful thud of rubber-soled security boots. A radio squawked, the static harsh and grating against the stillness. "Miss Vance? You okay down there?" "The breakers just reset." The voice of the guard broke the spell, but only physically. Alara didn't jump. She didn't look guilty. She simply inhaled deeply, a long, steadying breath that seemed to pull the scattered pieces of her persona back together. She took one step back, just one, creating a respectable, if still intimate, distance between us. She turned her head toward the corridor, her voice transforming instantly. The huskiness of the dark vanished, replaced by the cool, projecting authority of the head curator. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just checking the Etruscan case. The humidity sensors might need a reset." She looked back at me. The mask was back in place. The sharp suit, the perfect posture, the terrifying grace. But there was a crack in it. A subtle, deliberate crack she was leaving just for me. She reached up and smoothed the lapel of her blazer, a gesture that drew my eye to her hand, the same hand that had traced the pulse in my wrist moments ago. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It wasn't a professional smile. It was a conspiratorial one. "It seems," she said, her voice dropping just low enough that only I could hear it over the approaching footsteps, "that the museum is closing. You should probably make your exit before I have to ask security to escort you out." "I wouldn't want to cause a scene," I managed to say, though my heart was still hammering against my ribs. "Oh, I think it's too late for that," she murmured, her eyes dark and amused. "The scene has already happened. Now we're just dealing with the aftermath." I walked toward the exit, the transition from the climate-controlled sanctum of the East Wing to the main lobby feeling like waking from a lucid dream. The air grew warmer, less sterile, and the hum of the real world began to bleed back in. My legs felt heavy, not with fatigue, but with the strange gelatinous aftermath of an adrenaline crash. The security guard, Marcus, held the main door for me with a polite nod, completely oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere in the East Wing had been permanently altered, or that the woman he reported to had just had her hand on my throat in the dark. I stepped out into the evening air. The storm had finally broken. The violent, hammering deluge had reduced to a soft, rhythmic dripping from the limestone eaves. The city smelled of wet pavement, ozone, and the exhaust of passing taxis. A gritty, real-world perfume that contrasted sharply with the cedar and old paper scent of the gallery. I didn't turn around immediately. I stood on the top step of the museum's grand staircase, watching the city lights reflect in the oil-slicked puddles on the street. I was waiting. I knew, with the absolute certainty of gravity, that she wasn't staying inside. The connection we had forged in the blackout wasn't something you could just walk away from and return to filing paperwork. The heavy brass doors clicked open behind me a moment later. The rhythm of her heels was different on the wet stone, less echoing, more grounded. She came to stand beside me, leaning her hip against the stone railing. She had shed the clipboard and the keys, and with them, the rigid armor of her role. The hierarchy that existed inside those walls, the strict, insurmountable division between the guardian of the art and the observer, had dissolved the moment we crossed the threshold. Out here, under the clearing sky, we were just two women standing in the wet aftermath of a collision. "So," she said, looking out at the skyline rather than at me, her profile softened by the street lamps. "About those months of watching." I turned to face her. The amber glow of the city night caught the sharp line of her cheekbone and the softness of her mouth. A stray lock of hair had escaped her perfect bun, dancing in the light breeze. I thought I was being discreet. "You were terrible at it," she countered, finally turning her gaze to mine. There was a playfulness in her eyes now, a lightness that hadn't been possible inside the hushed halls. But I suppose I was terrible at ignoring it. We made quite a pair, didn't we? dancing around each other in the quiet, pretending the air wasn't catching fire every Tuesday at 3. I didn't want to disturb the peace, I said, feeling a smile tug at my lips. The peace was overrated, Alara replied. She shifted, her shoulder brushing mine. A deliberate, solid contact that sent a fresh wave of heat through the cool evening air. I prefer the storm. She checked her watch, a reflexive gesture that seemed more about buying time than knowing the hour. My shift is technically over, and I find myself with a significant amount of adrenaline and nowhere to put it. Is that so? It is. And since you're responsible for the adrenaline, I feel you should help manage the situation. She looked at me, her expression open and challenging. I know a place a few blocks over. The wine is decent, the corners are dark, and the electrical grid is decidedly more reliable. Or not, depending on what we prefer. The invitation hung between us, heavy with promise. It wasn't just about a drink. It was an acknowledgement that the game of cat and mouse was over, and the real interaction was beginning. The risk I had taken in the dark, the terrifying leap of faith to whisper my confession, had paid off in a way I hadn't dared to imagine. I felt a surge of triumph, a warm flush of victory that had nothing to do with art and everything to do with the woman standing next to me. I think, I said, stepping closer until I was back in her personal space, inhaling that familiar scent of rain and wood smoke, that I would prefer to keep the lights on for a while. I want to see exactly what I've been watching. Alara smiled, and it was a genuine, unguarded thing that transformed her face. She reached out, her fingers brushing my wrist again, finding the pulse point she had mapped in the dark. The ghost of her touch from the gallery solidified into a real, claiming grip. Then let's go, she said. Lead the way. I looked back at the museum one last time. It loomed behind us, massive and imposing, a fortress of history and silence. But it didn't look impenetrable anymore. It just looked like a building. The real masterpiece wasn't hanging on the walls inside. She was walking right beside me, her hand warm in mine. Sometimes you have to be willing to break the silence to hear the answer you've been waiting for. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more.